Hello, Steve Surfas, continuing here with this series of videos on free will. This time we're going to look at a text in the New Testament. It's actually in the Gospel of Matthew and then again in the Gospel of Luke regarding Jerusalem that I think is a key and a very informative and a verse we can learn things from in this respect in regard to free will. Matthew 23:37, Jesus speaking says, "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets and stone those sent to you, how often I have longed to gather your children together, as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were not willing." Here in this verse, there's two words that are key translated into English. "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets and stone those who sent you, how often I have longed to gather your children together." This longed is a Greek word which is thelo, which is really wanting to do or desiring or willing. And we're going to see in a minute how that's the same word we would use if we were talking about free will. How often I have longed to gather your children together. This is a very tender scene of Jesus towards the end of his ministry as it presented here in Matthew. Just looking at Jerusalem, and he's really sharing his heart with those disciples who were able to record this for us. A pain in his heart. "Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets and stone those sent to you, how often I have longed to gather your children together, as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings." Here we see Christ comparing himself to a female hen. For those of you who think it's always a man figure, here it's the woman or the motherly love of a hen. How I'd like a hen gathers her chicks under her wings. And then it says, "But you were not willing." Now both this "I have longed" is thelo, and "but you were not willing," but you did not thelo to coincide with this. Just to give you an idea how close this is and how key this verse is to free will. Well, before we do that, let me just say something about this. What was he wanting to do with Jerusalem? Just kind of have a little coffee and tea get together? When he says, "Gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings," obviously Jesus is talking about his desire to save and to have in a right relationship with him Jerusalem. Now we could look at this as that he wanted the majority of the people in Jerusalem, that he wanted the leaders. In any case, however we take that, he's talking in the end about people who he wanted to be in more than one person, groups of people, a large amount of people, depending on how you want to read that would be in fellowship with him. He thelo, to be able to gather them as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but they did not thelo. So this did not happen. So this kind of respect where God gives room for us to have a thelo, a will, or as it's translated here, "you were not willing," very pretty close to will in my book. Him allowing us to have a will independent of his will, and in many cases going against what he would will, is why in this series of videos I'm trying to show that the Bible teaches us that man has free will. In this case, free will to not accept what God would will and to draw us together into fellowship with him. Just to see how close this is to free will. Now it's a common word because it's about willing and desiring to do things, and has several definitions of the Greek. So I want to go through several passages just for us to get a feel of how this word is used. And again, not that it's used the same way every time. I know that's not true. But John 21, we see here, and this really just ties into free will for us to see how, if we were going to talk about free will, this word thelo in Greek would be the word we would use. John 21:18 says, "I tell you the truth, when you were younger, you dressed yourself." This is Jesus after he's resurrected, prophesying over Peter. And he says, John 21:18, "I tell you the truth, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and you went where you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go. So in this verse, he says, I tell you the truth, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted, where you thelo. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go, where you thelo not to go, where you do not thelo to go. So I think that lets us see here, like I say, this would be the word, and this is that we would use about talking about free will. Talking about God's will. I have some verses that talk about how this is used about God's will, and some verses about how it's used in our will. And again, because God allows us to will something different than what He would will for us, that is why we have an independent free will of Him. But let's keep looking. We'll see this in verses in Matthew 26:39. He says, going a little further, he fell down. This is Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. Going a little further, he fell down with his face to the ground and prayed, my Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me, yet not as I will, but as you will. So here in this dramatic prayer that we know, so important and so filled, obviously, and we talk about Jesus subjecting himself to the will of God through this prayer. And he says, my Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me, yet not as I, thelo, will, but as you, thelo, will. So again, another verse that we see here. And then in Matthew 16:24, Jesus uses this to talk about how we would respond. And he says, Matthew 16:24, when Jesus said to his disciples, if anyone would come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. And what he's saying here is, if anyone thelo, to come after me, would want to come after me, he must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. We see another picture, another verse here where this thelo is God, or in this case Jesus' will. In Mark 1:4, it's 41. Mark 1:41. I'm sorry. Filled with compassion, Jesus reached out his hand and touched the man. I am willing, he said, be clean. Immediately the leprosy left him and he was cured. Now he says here, I am willing, or I thelo, in response to the leper who says, if you're willing, if you want, I can be healed. And he says, I am willing, I thelo. And this is that creative healing power just that Jesus does by saying, I am willing, I thelo. In John 5:39, we see this thelo again exercised in rejecting the influence of God on their lives. John 5:39 and 40 says, you diligently study the scriptures because you think that by them you possess eternal life. These are the scriptures that testify about me, yet you refuse to come to me to have life. And this you refuse is this, you don't thelo to come to me, you opposite of thelo, to come to me to have life. So here Jesus is saying, I've given you the scriptures to try and have you come to me and know me, yet you refuse. You use this thelo will to not do that. In John 5:21, for just as the Father raises the dead and gives them life, even so the Son gives life to whom he is pleased to give it. The Son gives life to whom he is thelo, who he has this will to give it to. So we can see the richness and context of how this verse is used. And finally, one that we should all know in Matthew 6:9. This then is how you should pray. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come. Your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Your thelo be done on earth as it is in heaven. And an important verse that talks of the sovereignty of God in all of this. Romans 9:16. It does not therefore depend on man's desire or effort, but on God's mercy. So it does not depend on man's thelo. Man's thelo alone. With man's thelo, he can reject the gospel. He can reject God. But obviously it does not depend on man's thelo alone. Is not sufficient to reach God. It depends on God's mercy. Now, if you'll go back in the video series, I did some videos on free will in Romans 10. And I pointed out that if we look at just Romans 9, we're going to have one doctrine about free will. If we look at Romans 10, we're going to have another one. I will continue this. There's some more things I'd like to say about this in another video on this will in the case of Jerusalem.